Hi everybody, Vivek Patel here from Meaningful Ideas and Gentle Parents Unite. I am talking about conscious parenting, and I have been a social justice activist and ally for 30 years. It's something that's a very important part of my life journey. And I always thought that raising my child with a social justice lens was one of the most important parts of parenting. In fact, I don't think that we can do gentle parenting and conscious parenting without it. Because one of the main aspects of gentle parenting is shifting away from the oppressive patterns of the past of how we treat kids. So this is something that I talk a lot about with the parents that I support. I do a coaching call every Monday, and in the most recent one, I gave a whole talk on how we can raise our kids with a social justice lens and do it in a way that it becomes their value, not that we're imposing our value on them. So I wanted to share this talk with you, and I'd love to hear what you think. If you want to hear more about my teachings, please check out Meaningful Ideas on Facebook and YouTube and Instagram. I share a lot of stuff. There's a lot of great resources. And I'd also love to hear in the comments what you think about the ideas I share in this audio. Thank you very much, and I wish you all the best. All right, welcome to the coaching call today, everybody. Before we start, I usually give a little talk, and today I want to talk about social justice and how we can help our kids frame a social justice mindset. And what does that mean? So for me, what it means is it means people being aware of injustices in the world, oppression, power imbalances, and prejudice, and working on changing those patterns in themselves, in their homes, in their communities, and in the systems they engage with, and in the world in general. And this can happen in all sorts of ways. It can happen, like I mentioned, in an individual way. It can happen in the small sphere of influence that we have, talking to our friends and our family. It can happen in a larger context, like in the city that we're in, or in the town that we're in, or wherever we live. And how can we make a difference there? And how can we be aware of what's happening there? And then it can happen in a larger context. We can keep broadening out how we look at things. And part of it, of course, is the actions that we take. It's the words that we use. It's the way we engage with other people. It's the way we engage with the systems that we interface with, like the legal system and the education system and the financial system. And it's also about how we think, how we observe, and how we understand things. And I have been a social justice activist for 30 years. Last year was 30 years. I kind of started in 1990 when I started to really notice the injustices in the world. I hadn't really seen it before that. I was much more self-involved, and I think that's pretty normal for young people. But in 1990, when I was in my early 20s, I started to really notice it. I noticed sexism in a way I had never before. I noticed racism in a way that I had never before. I started to notice these things happening, and I started to notice them in me, which is a big one. Noticing them in me meant I was noticing my own self. I was noticing my own thoughts in a way I hadn't before. I was noticing my own attitudes in a way I hadn't before. And this was something that led me to really a lifelong journey of fighting against oppression, of trying to share messages of love and harmony and truth and how we can all be with each other, and how we can look at the world in such a way that we see the oppression of other people and we care about it, rather than turn ourselves away from it, rather than be afraid to look at it, that we have the courage to actually look at it and do something about it. And so that's what being a social justice activist means to me. It's certainly why I do the work around this parenting education stuff that I do, because I care about the oppression of children, which is one of the biggest oppressions that are out there, and certainly one of the least talked about. And maybe not in the circles we run in, because we hang out with parenting coaches online all the time. But in society in general, it's one of the most accepted forms of oppression, least understood forms of oppression. And so I have, dedicated myself in a lot of ways to sharing those messages. And I also have been a feminist. I call myself a radical feminist ally for 30 years, and been working myself through that. An anti-racism activist. In recent years, I've become very involved and care very much about ableism, because I had some great people taught me a lot of things around that and how insidious ableism is. And so for me in my own life, I take social justice very personally and find it very important. Sujai and I just recorded a podcast recently, last week, and I was talking about how people use the term social justice warrior as an insult. They shorten it to SJW. And it was actually like a couple of years after I heard that phrase that I realized people were saying it as an insult, because anytime somebody would call me a social justice warrior, I'd be like, oh, thank you. Yes, I am. And I'd be very proud and puff up my chest. Thank you for noticing. Because people use it as an insult, implying that we're taking it too extreme, or I don't even know. Honestly, I don't even know. It's an idea that we shouldn't be paying so much attention to it, and maybe we're too sensitive. But honestly, I think these are valid things to be sensitive about. And so this is something I identify with very deeply, and I care about very deeply. And I wanted to inspire that same mindset in my kid. I wanted her to really understand oppression and freedom, and have the sense of empathy and deep care for humanity that leads to social justice activism. People often talk about social justice as a thing that's rooted in hate, but it's I would say it's rooted in a lot of anger, and the anger is at the hate. It's not hate itself. And I think it's that understanding that we want to create a better world for all people that matters. And so I wanted to pass that mindset on to my kiddo. Now, when I say pass that mindset on, it doesn't mean that I wanted to impose my values on her. But it does mean that I wanted her to have her own very conscious relationship with social justice and understanding oppression and understanding her place in it. And so this is something that became important to me, and I thought a lot about how to pass on that mindset to my kiddo. And so I want to share a few ideas around how to do that. One of them is in how we model. We model ourselves. And as you know, in my parenting philosophy, I talk about 3 primary relationships that we have with kids. I actually call it the 3x3x4 relationships, but I'm not going to get into all of them. But the 3 primary ones are the relationship of model, guide, and friend. We are their model, we're their guide, and we're their friend. And of course, it works both ways. It's a mutual thing. And so for me, as a model, I wanted to model, in all of my interactions, I wanted to model a social justice mindset. I wanted to be aware of power differences, and I wanted to interact with my power differences in a way that had integrity and that really cared about the people's experience in those power differences. Because in so many aspects of life, we exist with power differentials. In what does systemic mean? And I was talking about how systemic prejudice often, or pretty much always, has to do with power differentials. And different people in different situations have different kinds of power. And to just be aware of that power is one thing, and then how we interact with it is another. So I wanted to always model whether I had power over somebody or I was under someone else's power. And I don't like to use those terms because I try not to live those terms, and at the same time, they exist. For example, I was a martial arts teacher for many, many years. And my students really loved me and respected me. And because of the relationship that we had, me as a teacher, them as students, them looking up to me and me as the guide, I had a certain kind of power over these people, And so, a lot of teachers, they don't use that power with the most integrity. And I always worked really hard to treat my students in such a way that was always empowering, uplifting, and that they could feel safe with me. And I made sure that my kid knew I was doing that. So I do something that's called modeling out loud. I don't just model, but I model out loud. I want to reveal my process and reveal my thinking and reveal my lens and reveal my work, my inner work, as I'm doing it to my kids so that they learn about their own process from my process. So I would talk very openly about how I would engage with the power of being a teacher. One of the things that I did, for example, was I wouldn't let my kids call me sensei. And in martial arts in general, you call the teacher sensei, at least in Japanese martial arts. In other martial arts, they would have other names for it, but you always give them this title of respect. And for me, I didn't want a title of respect. I wanted the respect of my students to come from who I am and from my skill and from what I could teach them. And so I didn't let my students call me sensei. They all called me Vivek. And then I would talk about it. I would say, hey, the reason I do that is that I have power over these people in a way, and I want to make sure that I use that power with great integrity because I want each person to feel respected. And I don't, it's not that I was telling her that, but I was showing her a lens that I see power through. So that when she would then be in a situation where she had power, then she would remember that and she would think, oh, I would also like to engage with the power I have in this situation in a way that has integrity, in a way that takes into consideration these other people's experience. And so modeling out loud is a big one. Like in the different areas of my life, in my work, in my relationships, in my friendships, I'm always looking out for how I'm treating people. And another way is modeling my own actions in the social justice world. What I say, how I talk about things, how I treat people, but also more actively, am I engaging in work around feminism and changing attitudes, anti-racism and changing the way things are done, speaking out when I notice things, and then letting her know about why I did it and how I feel and what the impact was and what the risk is as well, to understand that there's always a risk to speak out. And so I would model that in my life as well. So modeling is one great way to do that. And of course, the other big place that we model anti-oppression work and social justice work is how we treat our kids. Because as adults, as parents and caregivers, we have systemic power over our children. And systemic power, my saying for systemic power is power that you didn't choose and can't refuse. Systemic power is, for example, the power that I have with access to resources. Now, of course, my kid's 23. Now she can get a job and find a place, but she couldn't when she was 10 or 5 or even 13, right? And so I had all this systemic power over her. I could deny her resources. I could take all her stuff. I had physical power. I could put her in her room. Even if she went out, even if she got a paper route and made money and went out and bought something, I could just take it and she couldn't do anything about it. So I have all this systemic power. I could punish her. And of course, in extreme cases, I could hit her. So we have this power over kids. And again, how we engage with it informs them about what human relationships are about. And so one of the things that I was very careful with as she was growing up is I did my best not to use my systemic power to control her in any way. Every time I wanted to make a change, shift behavior, shift some kind of pattern, or educate, I focused on making sure I wasn't doing it using my systemic power. And this is really hard because systemic power is so tempting to use because it's right there. You just squint your eyes and you tell your kid with a stern voice to do something, and they're going to do it. Not for long, but at a certain age, they're going to do it. And that's an emotional systemic power that we have over them. And so, and then we can use punishments, and we can use consequences, and we can use rewards too. And so we use all of these different ways of manipulating kids. And then, of course, that informs them about the use of power, and then they go out and they reflect that understanding of power in their own relationships with us and with other people and with themselves. But if we want them to have a clear understanding about how we want to engage with these things, then we have to treat them in a way that reflects it as well. And so one of the most important things is for us to not use our power over our kids, but rather engage with them in a collaborative way, engage with them in a way where we respect them as equals, engage with them in a way that we work with them rather than do things to them, as Alfie Kohn says. And then we also speak it, because I would also talk to my kid about it, especially when she would go out into the world in school and see other families and how they interacted. I would say, other families and school system, they use these punishment and reward, comparative, better, worse, more value, less value, controlling ways of being. And we don't do that. I don't do that with you. It's not how I want us to interact. I want us to interact with respect and with love and with care for each other. And this is my commitment. This is what I'm doing. And by talking about it and doing it and constantly improving and working at it openly, it has demonstrated to her that it's something that we can do and that we can work towards, and we can make a difference in our lives, and we can treat each other that way. So she knows it's a reality that we can treat each other this way. And so now when she looks at the world, she has that lens. She sees racism through that lens. She knows that these things are painful and damaging and hurtful. I was going to say wrong, and I actually do think they're wrong if coming from a right-wrong mindset, but wrong doesn't really explain it, Just saying something's wrong doesn't really explain it. It doesn't really help us understand in our nervous system why. And I wanted her to understand it from the inside out. And so when our kids come to us with something, how we respond to it is so important, especially when it's something we might normally think of as negative and we would have a negative reaction to it. If our kids push back, if our kids say no, if our kids talk back to us, or if they set a boundary, there are so many different ways and so many opportunities for us to engage with them in a way that really helps them understand. That's one thing, how we model ourselves, model our own lives, and model how we treat them. Another thing is how we explore the world together. So kids are always exploring the world. They're always trying to understand things. They're always in a state of questioning and learning. I say always, it's a lot of time they're just playing as well. But even in play, there's a constant learning that's happening. I don't think there's a moment kids aren't learning in some way or another. And when we engage with them in that learning process and that learning mindset, it's so powerful. And so having explorations is something that we can really get into with them. And if we do it in a way that feels good to them, then they can be so into it, And then we can help them understand the reasons for things. So explaining the reasons for things, helping them frame what we're looking at. So for example, if you're watching TV and a commercial comes on TV, a lot of the time I'll talk about commercials. I'll talk about the demographic. I'll talk about the messages. I remember there was this, was it a beer commercial or a nachos commercial? Some commercial that was on TV where there was a group of friends, men and women, in the commercial, and the men did all the talking. Yeah, they were like in their mid-20s, right? The men did all the talking, and the women would like start to talk, but they never got to say anything, and the women just kind of smiled. And they didn't draw attention to it. It just is the way that the dynamic went. And I would point that out to my kid. I would say, hey, look at the imbalance in how they treat and how they portray the genders in this commercial. It's so interesting. And then I could say it reflects so much of the attitudes of society and how women are treated and how they're told to be quiet and how their ideas aren't as valid and how they're put down and condescended to. And I said, and then we would talk about that. How are people treated, and how do we want to treat people, and what different kinds of people are treated that way, and who has the power to do that? And then we would get into it, right? And it became something that we would see, and then we would see it in another area, and I would say, remember that commercial? It kind of relates to this. and then we would talk about it, right? So talking about the reasons for things, the context for things, and the framing of things, the exploration, and it's more than just like looking up a website. It's the whole life exploration that we do with our kids. That is a profound way to help them have a lens and have an understanding of how we want to treat people, and to see the way that people don't treat each other that way, and then have the desire to make a difference. Asking questions is another big part of that, so that it's not just one way, but I also ask kids a lot of questions. How do you feel about this? What do you think about this? How do you think this could have been done differently? How do you think that this pattern could be shifted, or these things could be healed? What do you think is wrong in this situation? Or, I said wrong. What do you think is painful or oppressive or challenging or ineffective or violent in this situation? What looks unequal here, and what could be more equal? And asking questions like that, because I find when we ask questions of kids, and then we take their ideas seriously, we don't say but we really listen, and we take them seriously, and we look for what's really powerful in what they say, because we can always find something. Because what we want to do is we want to help encourage them to think, encourage them to analyze, encourage them to think of their own values, and to really think about the kind of people they want to be, and how they want to engage in the world, and what kind of world they want to contribute to. I call those the self-reflective questions. And the self-reflective questions are so important, because when we have the self-reflective questions, when we engage with them, we help our kids. Exactly, we help them become self-reflective, and this is so powerful. The self-reflective questions. What are your values? What do you think is important? What kind of person do you want to be? What kind of world do you want to contribute to? What kind of relationships do you want to have? What kind of work do you want to do in the world? What kind of impact do you want to have? Different self-reflective questions are really powerful, and they're non-judgmental, and they're not leading, and at the same time, we help get kids thinking. And and another one is to talk about current events and history, and to help young people understand how what they're seeing in the world has come about. A lot of people are posting today about how if Martin Luther King was still alive, he'd be 90-something, and that's not that old. And the civil rights movement and segregation is a pretty recent phenomenon, and in the States, and the impact of it and the ripples of it are still deeply alive. But if somebody just looks at society as it is today and doesn't really understand the history of it, it has a whole different picture to it, And so talking about the history of how we came to where we are, the history of feminism, the history of racism, the history of, the more recent history of anti-ableism and the anti-homophobia, anti-transphobia, and all the different areas of oppressed and marginalized people, and understanding what they go through. So the present, I say current events, so the present context and the history that led up to it. And of course, you want to do it in a way that doesn't cause your kid to become afraid. We want to do it in a way that empowers them, that makes them, that gives them more knowledge and more context and more understanding. And there is a pain, of course, that comes with this knowledge. It's unfortunate, but it is something that's real. There is a pain that one carries when one understands and sees oppression clearly. That somebody who denies it is, in a way, saving themselves from that pain. And I live with that pain 24/7. And if you are like me, you probably do too. This idea of holding that pain, we can resist teaching our kids about history and teaching our kids about current event because we don't want to impose that pain on them. And I think there's a way of doing it in which we can maybe mitigate that pain. We can make it something that they that doesn't overwhelm them, that we do it in an age-appropriate way and we do it a little at a time. But trying to save them from it altogether, I don't think that we're actually doing them a favor. I think that is there's a certain kind of pain that actually helps us define who we are. Because that pain, that's part of my conscience. That pain, that remorse, that's what I tune into, that sense when I want to feel where my values are, where my direction is, what I feel, where I want to go with things, how I want to understand things, and how I want to engage with things, what I want to stand up against and resist, and what I want to support and empower. That pain is something that guides me in many ways. And I think my compassion does that, and my pain does that. It's two sides of my compass, And the compass has the north part of the magnet and the south part of the magnet. And I think those two magnets, those two poles, are my compassion and my pain. That's why my one-liner is, you can't spell compass without compassion, which is actually backwards, and I do it that way on purpose. But it's my compass, and I want my kid to really have a good sense of their compass. I want them to know their compass, both parts of their compass. And that's why, there's this video that's going around Facebook and other social media of this little kid who's watching a kid's show, and the dragon got separated from its mother, and she's just crying and crying over this dragon, and she's so sad. And the mother is saying, "Don't be sad, the dragon's okay." But you could feel and this kid's like 1 or 2 years old, right? And you could feel the deep empathy in this child, and the pain and the tears in this child coming out. So much connection to another person's suffering, another person's experience. And that pain, I saw that kid crying, and I was like, that is a beautiful pain. And it's not a pain I necessarily want to save them from by saying, it's okay, you don't have to be sad, the dragon's okay. I want to say, I really appreciate how deeply you feel for this dragon. It's so beautiful, I feel it too. And I really want to care about this dragon, and I'm glad you do too. And it's so beautiful. And so that is something that I think is something we can really help kids with, is their own natural sense of who they are, their sense of empathy, their sense of connection, so that they can feel that pain safely. If we make it unsafe for them, they turn away from it. And you see so many people out there that turn away from the pain of other people's suffering. Millions and millions of people all around the world are turning away from the pain of other people's suffering. I didn't want my kid to have that. I wanted her to have the courage and the inner resources and her relationship with that pain to turn towards it. Because when we turn towards it, it changes how we are. It changes how we walk in the world. It changes how we view things, how we view other people, how we view struggle, and we view our place in it. And so helping kids develop that compass, I think, is really important.